Ethan Cole had lived on his ranch for almost 10 years, and in all that time he had grown used to silence, the kind of silence that settles over open fields at sunset, when the wind moves gently across the grass and the only sound comes from the soft breathing of his horses. It was the kind of life he chose when he left the busy town far behind, hoping to build something steady and peaceful. But peaceful did not always mean simple. A ranch brought its own kind of work, the kind that started before sunrise and often stretched long after dark. Still, Ethan loved it. It gave him purpose, and it connected him to memories of his father, who once taught him how to mend fences, care for livestock, and read the changing moods of the land. But lately, the land felt different. It started with small things Ethan tried to ignore at first. One evening, he noticed a hammer missing from the shelf in the barn. He assumed he had misplaced it during the day. A few days later, a coil of rope was gone. Then the horses began acting strange. They stayed restless in their stalls, their ears twitching toward the open fields, as if they heard something Ethan could not. Once, he found the gate of the chicken coop open, even though he was sure he had locked it the night before. Nothing was taken, nothing was broken. But the gate swinging in the morning breeze made him feel unsettled in a way he could not explain. Ethan told himself that life on a remote ranch could play tricks on the mind. When you lived miles from anyone, even small mysteries felt bigger. Maybe a neighbor passed by. Maybe it was a wild animal. Maybe he was just tired. He tried to put it out of his mind, but every night the strange feeling grew. It was as if something or someone was watching the ranch from a distance. One late afternoon, after finishing repairs on a water trough, Ethan sat on his porch, sipping warm tea. The sky had turned a deep orange as the sun dipped behind the hills. It was usually his favorite time of day, the time he allowed himself to slow down and breathe. But on this particular evening, a cold sensation crawled up the back of his neck, making him straighten in his chair. His eyes moved slowly across the open fields. Everything looked normal. The grass swaying gently, the sky stretching wide, the barn standing like a trusted friend. But the uneasy feeling didn't fade. It grew stronger, like a quiet whisper telling him to pay attention. Ethan set his cup down and stood. He walked to the edge of the porch and narrowed his eyes. Far beyond the fence line, near the line of trees, something caught his attention, a shape still, dark, and standing upright. At first, he thought it might be a tree trunk or a fence post he had forgotten about. But as the light shifted, he could make out the outline of a person. The figure wasn't moving. It wasn't walking. It was simply there, watching. Ethan's heart gave a small jolt. It wasn't common for people to wander this far out, and if someone needed help, they usually called out or waved. This figure did neither. It just stood silently, like a shadow waiting for something. He took a slow breath, trying to calm the uneasy shiver that ran through him. Maybe it was another rancher. Maybe someone got lost. Maybe it was nothing at all. He lifted his hand slightly, thinking about shouting, but something inside him held him back. He could not explain why, but the stillness of the figure made him feel that speaking too soon would be a mistake. Instead, Ethan stepped down from the porch and walked toward his truck, planning to get a pair of binoculars. As he reached for the door, he heard a sound, a soft scrape like a boot dragging lightly across dirt. He froze and slowly turned his head back toward the field. The figure had moved. Not much, but enough that Ethan could see its posture more clearly. It was facing him, standing upright with an unsettling stillness, almost as if it had been waiting for Ethan to notice. A whisper escaped Ethan's lips without him thinking. "Please. Just make it fast." He wasn't speaking to the figure. He wasn't expecting an answer. It was just something he said when he felt a long night of work or trouble coming ahead. But the moment the words left his mouth, the figure shifted again. Its head turned, not quickly, not sharply, but slowly, like it was studying him. That slow turn sent a chill deeper into Ethan's bones. The distance between them was too far to see a face clearly. But the figure's stance gave the impression of a stare, direct and unblinking. a stare that felt heavier than it should have from so many yards away. Ethan swallowed hard, unsure why his chest felt tight. He looked away for a moment, rubbing his palms against his jeans, trying to think rationally. Maybe it was a trick of the light. Maybe exhaustion was catching up with him again. He had been waking earlier, working later, trying to get ahead before winter storms returned. Lack of sleep could do strange things to the mind, but when Ethan looked back toward the trees, the figure was still there, silent, unmoving. He reached slowly for the binoculars inside his truck. As he lifted them and focused the lens, his hands shook slightly. He steadied his breath, adjusted the focus, and finally brought the shadowy shape into clearer view. The figure appeared to be a man, tall and thin, wearing dark clothing that blended into the evening shadows. But what unsettled Ethan most was the posture. The man stood too straight, too still. There was no shift of weight, no natural movement, no sign of breathing. His face was obscured by distance and dim light. Yet Ethan felt, with an inexplicable sense of certainty, that the man was staring directly at him. Ethan lowered the binoculars, pressing his lips together. He felt the old wooden porch boards behind him calling him back to safety, back to the familiar. But a part of him refused to retreat. This was his ranch. He needed to know who or what was standing on the edge of his land. As he stared across the field, the figure suddenly turned and moved back into the line of trees. Not hurried, not panicked, just a slow retreat. As if it had seen enough for the moment, Ethan let out a breath he had been holding without realizing it. The figure was gone, swallowed by shadows. But the uneasy feeling did not leave with it. Instead, it settled deeper in his mind. He knew he should go inside and lock the doors. But he didn't. He walked slowly toward the fence line, stopping halfway. When he realized how quickly the darkness was falling, the wind carried a faint, earthy smell from the trees, but it also carried a sense of something unspoken, something waiting. Ethan stood there for several long moments, listening to the quiet. His mind drifted to the stories his father used to tell, stories about unexplained sightings on lonely ranches, about how the land sometimes held memories that people could not easily understand. His father always said that the land spoke to those who lived close to it. Sometimes it whispered. Sometimes it warned. Tonight, Ethan felt as if it was warning him. But of what? He walked back to the porch, his boots scraping softly against the dirt. As he stepped inside the house, he paused by the door and looked over the field one last time. The trees stood still, their dark shapes unmoving. The figure was gone. But Ethan had the strong feeling it would not be the last time he saw it. He shut the door gently, not wanting to disturb the quiet outside. He leaned against it, closing his eyes, trying to reason with himself. It could have been a stranger passing through. It could have been nothing important. But the cold feeling he felt earlier still lingered in his chest. And deep down, Ethan knew that whatever he saw tonight was only the beginning. Ethan barely slept that night. Even though he tried to tell himself that everything was fine, his mind kept replaying the strange moment when the figure turned its head toward him. There was something unnatural about that movement, something slow, deliberate, almost thoughtful. It left a heavy feeling in his chest that he couldn't shake off. No matter how many times he tried to convince himself that it was simply a lost traveler or someone passing by. When morning light finally reached the ranch, Ethan stepped outside, hoping daylight would wash away the strange worries from the night before. The sun warmed the grass and the dew sparkled softly, as if nothing unusual had happened. But even in the bright light, Ethan caught himself glancing toward the line of trees again and again. The area looked completely ordinary now. Birds hopped around the branches. Wind moved gently through the leaves. There was no sign of the mysterious figure. Still, he could not ignore the memory of that stare. Ethan went about his day as usual. He fed the horses, checked their hooves, repaired a loose hinge on the barn door, and inspected the fences. But all the while, he kept thinking back to the stories his father used to tell him. His father, Henry Cole, was never one to make up wild tales. He was a practical man, grounded and strong. But even he spoke occasionally about strange sightings on the land. Figures on distant hills, shadowy shapes near old wells, silhouettes standing still at sunset. At the time, Ethan had always thought those stories were just ways for his father to make long evenings more interesting. But after last night, they didn't feel like stories anymore. They felt like warnings. By afternoon, Ethan decided to take a ride on his horse, Scout, to clear his head. Scout was a loyal, gentle horse, calm and steady on long rides. Ethan saddled him up and led him toward the open fields. As they moved across the land, Ethan let the fresh air settle his thoughts. He directed Scout toward the area where he had seen the figure the night before. The ground there was soft from recent rain, and Ethan hoped he might find footprints or some sign that someone had been there. When he reached the tree line, he slowed the horse and climbed down. The earth was uneven, dotted with fallen leaves and small branches. Ethan knelt and examined the ground closely. There were no clear footprints, nothing that proved beyond doubt that a person had stood there. But he did notice something unusual, a patch of dirt that looked smoother than the surrounding area, almost as if someone had brushed it over intentionally. He touched the soil with his fingertips. It felt cool and freshly disturbed. Ethan stood up slowly, scanning the trees around him. The forest beyond was thick and quiet. Nothing moved except the occasional sway of branches in the wind. But even with the forest appearing calm, Ethan felt watched. Not in a frightening way, but in a way that made him feel small, like the land held secrets far older than him. He wiped his hands on his jeans, climbed back onto Scout, and rode home. Later that afternoon, Ethan decided to visit his neighbor, Old Man Harper. Harper lived about 2 miles away, running a ranch even older than Ethan's. If anyone knew about strange happenings around the land, it would be him. Harper was a quiet man, but he had seen more seasons of ranch life than almost anyone else in the region. Ethan rode over, tied Scout near the fence, and found Harper sitting on his porch repairing an old lantern. Harper looked up with a calm smile. "Morning, Ethan. You look a bit troubled." Ethan hesitated for a moment, unsure if he should bring up what he saw, but the memory weighed heavily on him, and he felt that he needed answers even if the answers didn't make sense. "Harper," Ethan began, "have you ever seen something strange out here? Like someone standing where they shouldn't be?" Harper stopped polishing the lantern and looked at Ethan with a slow, thoughtful expression. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in understanding. "What kind of strange?" "A figure," Ethan replied. "Tall, standing still near the trees. I couldn't make out the face, but it felt like he was watching me." Harper set the lantern aside and leaned back in his chair. "When did this happen?" "Last night," Harper nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he already suspected. He ran a hand through his white beard and sighed. "Ethan, your father ever talked to you about things he saw on the land?" Ethan nodded. "A few stories, yes. I always thought he was just making things sound interesting." Harper shook his head gently. "Henry wasn't the type to exaggerate. He saw things. We all did. This land has been here long before any of us. And sometimes, it remembers things we don't." Ethan felt a chill travel down his spine at the quiet certainty in Harper's voice. "So you're saying what I saw was real?" I'm saying it might be," Harper replied softly. "You're not the first rancher to see someone standing still on the edge of your land. Your father mentioned it too. Many times." Ethan leaned forward, curious and uneasy. "Did he ever say who it was? Or why?" Harper hesitated, choosing his words with care. "Your father believed the figure wasn't there to harm anyone. He thought it was connected to something old, something your family once promised or started, long before you were born." Ethan frowned slightly. "A family promise?" Harper nodded again. "Your father never told me the full story. But he always said the figure appeared during moments of stress. Moments when a Cole felt overwhelmed or uncertain. It was like the land reminding them of unfinished business." Ethan felt a deep, strange pull in his chest. "Why didn't he ever tell me this directly?" "Maybe he thought you didn't need to know yet," Harper said quietly. "Or maybe he hoped the past would stay buried." Ethan thanked Harper for his time and rode home with more questions than answers. The sun was beginning to dip again as he approached his house, casting long shadows over the fields. As he removed Scout's saddle and hung it in the barn, he couldn't stop thinking about Harper's words: a family promise, unfinished business, a figure appearing during times of stress. Ethan walked slowly back to the house and paused by the porch. He looked across the open land, half expecting to see the silhouette again. The fields lay quiet, golden in the fading sunlight. But even in their calmness, he sensed something beneath the surface, like a truth waiting patiently to be discovered. After dinner, Ethan sat at his small wooden table and pulled out an old wooden box he had kept for years. Inside were his father's belongings: a pocket knife, a worn leather wallet, a few faded photographs, and a small notebook. Ethan opened the notebook carefully. The pages were yellowed, the handwriting neat but hurried in some places. He flipped through until he reached a page that made his breath catch. There, written in his father's familiar handwriting, were the words, "The figure returned." Below it, several notes about sightings, dates, and the same uneasy feelings Ethan had felt. His father had seen it too many times. Ethan read deeper. His father never wrote the figure's name or identity, but he mentioned a connection to something that happened years before Ethan was born, something related to a friend or stranger who once lived near the land. The notes hinted at a situation filled with emotion, regret, and unfinished conversations. But the details were missing, as if his father had chosen not to write them down. Ethan closed the notebook slowly. The house felt even quieter than usual. He could hear the ticking of the old clock on the wall, the soft hum of the night breeze slipping through the cracks, and the distant sound of an owl calling from the woods. He sat in silence for a long time, thinking about everything he had learned today: the disturbed soil, Harper's words, his father's notes. Then, without knowing why, he whispered again, "Please, just make it fast." This time, the words were not about ranch work. They were about the truth, whatever truth was waiting for him. And deep inside, Ethan felt certain that the figure wasn't done with him yet. For the next few days, Ethan tried to return to his normal routine, but nothing felt normal anymore. Every time he stepped outside, his eyes drifted toward the tree line. He ate meals quickly, slept lightly, and listened closely to even the smallest sounds around the ranch. The figure had not appeared again since that night, but the absence felt just as heavy as the presence had. It was like the figure was waiting patiently, silently, just beyond the reach of Ethan's sight. The strange events around the ranch did not stop. Tools kept shifting to different corners of the barn. A wooden stool he always kept near the door had moved one morning, placed perfectly in the middle of the barn, as if someone had sat there during the night. The horses continued acting restless. Scout in particular seemed to refuse to stand near the barn entrance once the sun went down. He would pull back gently, then more firmly, as if trying to warn Ethan not to go in. Ethan tried to ignore these changes, but his mind kept going back to the notes in his father's old notebook. The handwriting, the careful dates, the simple phrases describing the figure, it all showed how deeply his father had tried to understand the strange presence on the land. Now Ethan felt the weight of that same mystery pressing heavily on his shoulders. It was something old, something emotional, and something connected to his family in a way he still didn't understand. One afternoon, after a long day of repairing fences and checking the animals, a storm began brewing in the distance. Dark clouds rolled across the sky faster than usual, and the wind picked up sharply, carrying the smell of rain and dust. Ethan looked out across the field and felt a knot tighten in his stomach. Something about the growing storm felt different, as if it was carrying more than just weather. By evening, rain began falling in steady sheets, tapping against the roof like thousands of tiny drumming fingers. The sky flickered with lightning now and then, lighting up the fields in pale flashes. Ethan lit a few lamps inside the house and sat near the window, watching the storm intensify. The wind howled softly at first, then grew louder, making the wooden walls creak. As lightning flashed again, Ethan felt that same uneasy sensation from before, the feeling that he was not alone. He moved closer to the window and scanned the yard. The rain made it difficult to see clearly, but something in the shadows near the porch seemed out of place. He grabbed his coat and stepped outside, Rain immediately soaked through his sleeves, cool and sharp against his skin. He stood under the porch roof for a moment and looked into the darkness. The storm made everything look unfamiliar. Shadows danced with each flash of lightning, and the wind carried strange echoes across the open fields. Then he heard footsteps. Soft, slow footsteps moving across the porch floor. Ethan's pulse quickened. He turned his head slightly, listening. The footsteps stopped. He waited, barely breathing. A few seconds passed, and then he heard them again, 3 gentle steps, then silence. He turned toward the sound. And there, standing just beyond the glow of the porch light, was the same figure he had seen on the night near the trees. The same tall shape, drenched from the rain, still and silent as ever. But this time, it was closer. Much closer. Ethan felt his breath catch. A strange mixture of fear, curiosity, and something he couldn't name washed over him. His first instinct was to step back inside the house. But his feet stayed rooted to the porch floor. The figure did not move toward him. It stood patiently, waiting for something. The storm rumbled overhead. Water dripped from the figure's clothing. The porch light flickered softly, casting brief waves of light over its outline. Ethan took a slow breath. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice steadier than he felt. The figure didn't respond, but it lifted its head slightly, as if acknowledging the question. Ethan took one step forward, the sound of his boots muffled by the storm. The figure remained still, neither approaching nor backing away. Lightning flashed again, and for a brief moment, Ethan thought he glimpsed part of the figure's face. There was something familiar about it, something that made his chest tighten, but the light was too quick, and the shadows swallowed the details again. Ethan swallowed and tried again. "What do you want?" This time, the figure shifted its posture. Not in a threatening way, but in a way that suggested it was about to speak. Ethan felt a shiver run through him, not from fear, but from anticipation. He had been waiting for answers for so long, and now the moment felt close. Then, after a long silence, the figure finally spoke. Its voice was soft, low, and filled with an emotion Ethan could not immediately understand. It sounded tired, as if it carried years of unspoken stories. "You left something unfinished," the voice said. Ethan's breath froze. "What do you mean?" Lightning flashed again, and this time Ethan saw the figure more clearly. The man standing in the rain looked older than Ethan expected, with lines on his face and eyes that carried deep, quiet sadness. There was no sign of anger or threat in his expression. Instead, there was something gentle, almost sorrowful. "You don't remember me," the figure said softly. "But your father did, and he hoped one day you would understand." Ethan stared in shock. He could not find his voice for a moment. His mind raced through memories of his father. Old neighbors, old workers on the ranch, but nothing connected. No face matched the one in front of him. "I don't know you," Ethan whispered. The man nodded slowly, accepting the truth without disappointment. "I didn't expect you to. Your father and I shared something many years ago, something that changed both of our lives. But he never finished what he promised." Ethan stepped closer. Rain splashed against his boots, and the wind tugged at his coat. "What promise?" The man's eyes softened. "A promise to return. A promise to speak honestly. A promise to bring peace to a story that was never told." Ethan felt a chill, not from fear, but from the weight of the man's words. "Why come now? Why appear to me? Why?" The man took a slow breath. "Because you are the last one who can give the story its ending. And because the land remembers. It brought me here." Ethan looked at the fields stretching into darkness. He remembered Harper's words. Sometimes the land remembers what people forget. His father's notes. The disturbed soil. The sense of being watched. It all connected now, forming a puzzle Ethan didn't yet understand. The man continued. "I never came to harm anyone. I came because a truth was left behind. And the longer it stayed silent, the heavier it became." A quiet moment passed between them, filled only by the sound of rain. Ethan realized something then, something unexpected. The fear he felt at first had changed. It wasn't fear of danger. It was fear of not knowing. Fear of facing something deeply emotional and long hidden. But the man in front of him didn't feel like a threat. He felt like someone carrying a burden he had held too long. Ethan's voice softened. "Then tell me everything." The man looked at him with a mixture of relief and sadness. "Not here, not tonight, but soon. When the storm passes and the land is quiet again, you will understand." Ethan nodded slowly. "Will you return?" The man's expression changed in a way Ethan couldn't describe, something gentle, something grateful. "Yes. When it is time." Then, without another word, the man stepped back from the porch, turned toward the field, and walked slowly into the rain. He didn't hurry. He didn't disappear suddenly. He simply walked, the storm swallowing him little by little until he blended into the darkness, becoming just another shadow in the distance. Ethan stood there long after the man vanished. The storm continued, but its sound felt different now, less harsh, more like a steady rhythm guiding him toward the truth. Ethan knew that whatever was coming next would change everything he thought he knew about his father, the ranch, and himself. He stepped back inside the house, water dripping from his coat, and closed the door gently. The clock ticked softly on the wall. The lamps flickered, and inside Ethan, a strange mixture of fear and hope began to grow. Something unfinished had returned, and soon, he would finally hear the story behind the devil's stare. Ethan woke the next morning feeling strangely calm. The storm had passed during the night, leaving the ranch washed clean and quiet. The sky was pale blue, and sunlight shimmered across the wet grass. Everything looked peaceful. Yet Ethan felt the weight of the previous night deep in his chest. He kept thinking about the man, the figure who finally spoke, his tired voice, his gentle sadness, and the strange promise that the truth would be told soon. Ethan stepped out onto the porch and breathed in the fresh morning air. The world outside felt different, as if something had shifted during the storm. The usual sounds of the ranch were there, the wind brushing against the fence, the distant calls of birds, the soft movements of the horses, but underneath those sounds was a quiet rhythm, like the land itself was waiting. Ethan spent the morning doing chores slowly. He fed Scout, checked the chicken coop, and fixed a loose board on the side of the barn. But his mind wasn't on his work. He kept remembering the man's words. "Your father hoped one day you would understand." There was something emotional behind that sentence, something that felt heavier than the land itself. By midday, Ethan could no longer stand the silence of not knowing. He went inside the house and took out his father's old notebook again. He flipped through the pages, studying each line carefully. The notes were brief, but they were filled with meaning. Dates, sightings, feelings. His father tried to understand. Then Ethan found something he hadn't noticed before. A small folded paper tucked between two pages near the back of the notebook. He unfolded it carefully. On the paper was a simple map. It showed the ranch, the fence line, the barn, and then a large X marked near the far west edge of the property, close to an old, unused storage shed. Ethan stared at the mark. Why would his father hide a map inside the notebook? What was the X supposed to be? And why did the figure reappear only now? He folded the paper back up, slipped it into his jacket pocket, and stepped outside. The air was cool and still. Ethan saddled Scout and guided him toward the western side of the ranch. The ground was soft from the storm, and small puddles reflected the sky like mirrors. As they approached the old storage shed, Ethan felt the same pressure in his chest that he had felt the night before. It wasn't fear exactly, it was something deeper, a kind of emotional pull, as if he was moving toward something that belonged to him without realizing it. He dismounted near the shed. The old wooden building leaned slightly to one side, its roof covered with dry branches. It had been unused for years. Ethan pushed the door gently. It creaked open, dust floating in the air as sunlight entered the dim space. Inside, the shed was filled with old tools, broken chairs, and wooden boxes covered in cobwebs. Ethan stepped carefully through the clutter, searching for something that might explain the map. Then he noticed a box pushed far back into the corner, half buried under old blankets. He dragged it out, wiped off the dust, and opened it. Inside were several items: an old photograph, a folded jacket, a journal, and a small wooden carving of a horse. Ethan picked up the photograph first. It showed his father, young and smiling, standing next to another man. A man who looked exactly like the figure Ethan had seen on the porch. Ethan froze. His father knew the man. They were close. You could see it in their relaxed expressions, their casual posture, the way they stood shoulder to shoulder like brothers. Ethan's mind spun with questions. Who was this man? Why had his father kept this hidden? Why did the man say a promise was left unfinished? He reached for the journal next. It was old, with worn pages and faded ink. As he flipped through it, the story slowly unfolded. The man's name was Daniel. He and Ethan's father had grown up together, working on the same land. They shared dreams, hopes, and a deep friendship. But something happened, something emotional and difficult. The journal didn't explain it clearly at first, but as Ethan read deeper, he found the truth. There had been a misunderstanding, a disagreement that hurt both men deeply. It wasn't about anger or betrayal, it was about pride and unspoken words. Daniel had left the ranch one evening after a long conversation that ended without resolution. Ethan's father had tried to talk to him the next day, but Daniel never returned. Years passed, and both men carried the heavy weight of regret. Ethan's father wrote in the journal that he believed Daniel would come back someday, and he promised himself he would apologize, speak honestly, and make peace. But Daniel never returned while Ethan's father was alive. The last entry in the journal read, "If he ever comes back, I hope he finds understanding. I hope my son understands too." Ethan closed the journal slowly. Everything felt clear and unclear at the same time. Daniel wasn't a mysterious spirit or a stranger with dark intentions. He was a man carrying a memory, a friendship, and a promise left unspoken. He had returned not out of anger, but because the past remained unfinished. Ethan stepped out of the shed and looked across the field, where the grass moved gently in the soft breeze. He imagined his father standing with Daniel years ago, laughing, working together, sharing stories. A deep sadness touched Ethan's heart, not a painful sadness, but a gentle one, filled with understanding. Then he heard footsteps, soft, steady footsteps, approaching from behind. He turned. Daniel stood a few yards away, the sunlight falling softly on his tired face. He looked calmer today, his posture relaxed, his expression kinder than before. Ethan felt no fear, only a strange familiarity, like he was meeting someone he had known long ago. "You found it," Daniel said quietly. Ethan nodded. "Why did my father never tell me?" he asked gently. Daniel sighed, looking out toward the fields. "Because he carried regret. And regret is a heavy thing. He wanted to tell you, but he didn't want to pass that weight to you too soon." Ethan stepped closer. "He wrote that he hoped you would find understanding, and he hoped I would too." Daniel's eyes softened. "Your father was a good man. We had a misunderstanding, something simple, but we let it grow larger than it should have. We never spoke again. I left, thinking we would talk the next day. But life took me far away. To Untamed." Ethan listened quietly, his heart warm with empathy. Daniel continued. "Years later, I came back, hoping to see him again. But by then, it was too late." Ethan lowered his head. "I'm sorry." Daniel shook his head gently. "No, Ethan. That's why I returned to finish what your father wanted to finish. Not with him, but with you." Ethan felt tears gather in his eyes, not from sadness, but from the beauty of a long, unfinished story slowly finding closure. "How can I finish it?" he asked softly. Daniel stepped closer, his voice warm and steady. "Listen to the land. Remember your father's kindness. Carry forward the peace he wanted, and speak openly when you feel hurt. Don't let silence become a wall between you and the people you care about. Ethan nodded slowly. He understood each word deeply. Daniel looked around the ranch, his expression peaceful. Your father loved this land. And he loved you. I came to make sure you heard the truth, not an old story of shadows, but a story of friendship and regret. Ethan felt a calmness settle in his chest. Thank you, he whispered. Daniel gave a gentle smile. The kind of smile that carries years of memories. I can rest now. The promise is complete. A soft breeze moved through the field, carrying warmth instead of cold. The air felt lighter, freer. Daniel took one last look at the ranch he had once known, then took a quiet step back. His form became softer in the sunlight, like he was blending into the brightness rather than the darkness. Ethan watched with a peaceful heart, knowing this moment was not one of fear, but of closure. As Daniel's figure faded slowly, Ethan whispered the same words he had spoken on the first night, only this time they carried a new meaning. Please, just make it fast. But he wasn't asking for trouble to pass quickly. He was asking for peace to settle gently and fully. The land fell quiet again, calm, warm, and complete. And Ethan finally felt the truth rest inside him, steady and clear. The unfinished story had finally found its ending.